Here are the top 9 biggest lies about dietary fat and cholesterol. The areas of nutrition and disease prevention are full of incompetence. We have been wrongly advised to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol despite no evidence of harm. Here are the top 9 biggest lies, myths, and misconceptions about dietary fat and cholesterol. Number 1. A low-fat, high-carb diet is the optimal human diet. Back in the 60s and 70s, many prominent scientists believed that saturated fat was the main cause of heart disease by raising the bad cholesterol in the blood. This idea was the cornerstone of the low-fat diet. Because of a few bad studies and misguided political decisions, this diet was recommended to all Americans in the year 1977. However, there wasn't a single study on this diet at the time. The American public became participants in the largest uncontrolled experiment in history. This experiment didn't turn out very well, and we are still suffering from the consequences. This graph shows how the obesity epidemic started at almost the exact same time the low-fat guidance came out. The diabetes epidemic followed soon after. Of course, a graph like this doesn't prove anything. Correlation doesn't equal causation. But it seems plausible that the low-fat recommendations made things worse because people started eating less of healthy foods like meat, butter, and eggs while eating more processed foods high in sugar and refined carbohydrates. Even though there was little evidence at the time, the low-fat diet had actually been thoroughly studied in the past few years and decades. It was put to the test in the biggest controlled trial in nutrition history, the Women's Health Initiative. In this study, 48,835 postmenopausal women were split into 2 groups. One group ate a low-fat diet with the whole grain and all that, while the other group continued to eat normally. After a period of 7.5 to 8 years, the low-fat group weighed only 0.4 kilograms, 1 pound, less than the control group, and there was no difference in the rate of heart disease or cancer between groups. Other huge studies also found no advantages for a low-fat diet, but it doesn't end there. Unfortunately, the low-fat recommendation by most nutrition organizations is not only ineffective, it may even be downright harmful. In multiple human studies, the low-fat diet has actually made some important risk factors worse, raising triglycerides, lowering HDL, the good cholesterol, and making the LDL particles smaller. Despite miserable results in a study, many nutritionists all over the world continue to recommend the low-fat diet that is hurting more people than it helps. The bottom line, there is no evidence that low-fat diets have any benefits. They do not cause weight loss in the long term or reduce the risk of chronic diseases. Some studies show that they may even cause harm. Number 2. Cholesterol-rich foods, like eggs, are bad for you. Nutritional professionals have had remarkable success in demonizing perfectly healthy foods. Probably the worst example of that is eggs, which are among the healthiest foods on the planet. Just think about it. The nutrition in an egg are enough to turn a single fertilized cell into an entire baby chicken. Even so, because eggs contain large amounts of cholesterol, they were believed to cause heart disease. However, studies actually show that the cholesterol in the diet does not raise the bad cholesterol in the blood. Eggs raise HDL, the good cholesterol, and not associated with the increased risk of heart disease. What we're left with is an incredibly healthy food loaded with vitamins, minerals, and powerful nutrients that are important for the eyes and brain. Keep in mind that almost all the nutrients are found in the yolk. The white is nothing but protein. Telling people to ditch the yolks may be just the most ridiculous nutrition advice in history. The bottom line, eggs were demonized because of the high amounts of cholesterol, but new studies show that they don't raise cholesterol in the blood or contribute to heart disease. Eggs are among the most nutritious foods on the planet. And as a side note, to really get the nutrition out of an egg, the closer to fully raw the egg is, the better. Yes, that means if you're going to eat eggs and you're eating it for the nutrition, try to eat it raw, which means it has to be a free-range, a GMO egg, and the chicken must have been fermented and not pumped full of hormones and stuff like that. Number 3, your total and LDL cholesterol levels are good indicators of heart attack risk. Probably the biggest mistake in modern medicine is focusing too much on total and LDL cholesterol levels as indicators of heart attack risk. Well, it is true that elevated levels of both are associated with increased risk, but the whole picture is much more complicated than that. Total cholesterol actually includes lots of things, including HDL, also known as the good cholesterol. Having high HDL actually raises your total cholesterol number. LDL cholesterol isn't just LDL either. There are subtypes. We have the small, dense LDL particles, very bad, and then we have the large, fluffy LDL, good. The small particles are associated with heart disease, while the larger ones are mostly benign. Studies actually show that total and LDL cholesterols are poor indicators of risk compared to the markers like the triglycerides, HDL ratios. One study found that out of 231,986 patients hospitalized for heart disease, half of them actually had normal LDL levels. There are also studies showing that high cholesterol can be protective. In old individuals, the higher the cholesterol, the lower your risk of heart disease. Not to mention that cholesterol levels that are too low are actually associated with increased risk of death from other causes like cancer and suicide. Despite the weak predictive value of total and LDL cholesterol, people with elevated numbers are often instructed to lower cholesterol by any means necessary, including a low-fat diet, which doesn't work, and statin drugs. Right now, millions of people all around the world are taking cholesterol-lowering drugs without needing them, unnecessarily suffering the risk of serious side effects. Bottom line, total and LDL cholesterol levels are actually quite poor markers of heart disease risk. Many people are being unnecessarily medicated because doctors tend to focus on these numbers. Number 4, processed seed and vegetable oils are healthy. For some very strange reason, processed seed and vegetable oils become recognized as health foods. Humans only started consuming them about 100 years ago because we didn't have the technology to process them until then. Yet somehow the nutrition geniuses figured that these would somehow be very healthy for humans and certainly better than the dangerous saturated fats. These oils, which include soybean, corn, and cottonseed oils, are very high in polyunsaturated omega-6 fatty acids, which are harmful in excess and can contribute to inflammation. Despite these oils being recommended to reduce heart disease, there are actually multiple studies showing that they increase the risk. In a study that looked at common cooking oils on the U.S. market, they found that 0.56% to 4.2% of the fatty acids in them were highly toxic trans fats. However, these oils are actually recommended by the beloved organizations that are supposed to be in charge of protecting our health. This is one example of where blindly following the conventional nutrition wisdom can put you in an early grave. Bottom line, processed seed and vegetable oils are very unhealthy, loaded with omega-6 fatty acids and trans fats that can contribute to disease. Number 5, saturated fat raise your bad cholesterol and cause heart disease. The war on saturated fat has been a miserable failure. It was initially based on flawed studies, but somehow became public policy with disastrous consequences. The worst part is, the government and health organizations have yet to change their position despite overwhelming evidence that they've been wrong all along. Actually, saturated fat doesn't really raise LDL that much. The effect on weak and inconsistent and appears to depend on the individual. When saturated fat does affect LDL, it changes the particle from small, dense, very, very bad, to large LDL, which is mostly benign. Saturated fat also raises HDL cholesterol, which is associated with a reduced risk of heart disease. If anything, saturated fat actually improves the lipid profile, not the other way around. In the past few years, many massive studies have examined the link between saturated fat and heart disease risk. One of these studies include 347,747 participants and look at data from 21 studies. The conclusion: there is no evidence that saturated fat increases the risk of heart disease. Many other studies confirm these findings. Saturated fat is harmless. The truth is, saturated fat never has been and never will be proven to raise heart disease because it simply isn't true. Bottom line, despite decades of anti-fat propaganda, saturated fat has never been proven to cause heart disease. In fact, saturated fat improves some of the most important risk factors for heart disease. Number 6, saturated fat and trans fats are similar. Trans fats are unsaturated fats that have been chemically modified to be more solid and have a longer shelf life. They are also known as partially hydrogenated fats. The manufacturing process is very disgusting, involving high pressure, high heat, a metal catalyst, and hydrogen gas. The fact that anyone thought these nasty fats would be suitable for human consumption is baffling. Some of the major health organizations have started to confuse people by grouping trans fats together with saturated fats, calling them the bad fats. However, like I said before, saturated fats is completely harmless, but the same cannot be said for trans fats. Trans fats are highly toxic and can cause insulin resistance, inflammation, and significantly raise the risk of serious diseases like heart disease. Even though consumption has gone down, trans fats are still found in processed foods, and the FDA still categorizes them as generally regarded as safe. If you want to avoid chronic disease, then eat your butter, meat, and coconut oil, but avoid trans fats as if your life depended on it. It does. Bottom line, trans fats resemble saturated fats in consistency and shelf life, but the chemical composition is still very different. When saturated fats are harmless, while saturated fats are harmless, trans fats are highly toxic and should be avoided at all costs. Number 7, eating fats make you fat, and high-fat diets are dangerous. Fat is the stuff that lodges under your skin and makes us look soft and puffy. Therefore, eating more fat should make us store more of it. You are what you eat, right? Well, it actually isn't that simple. Even though fat has more calories per gram compared to protein and carbs, foods that are naturally high in fat are very fulfilling and hard to overeat. In fact, studies on diets that are high in fat and low in carbs show that these diets cause more weight loss than diets that are low in fat. Low carb, high fat diets also lead to all sorts of other benefits: increased HDL cholesterol, lowering triglycerides, lower blood sugar and insulin levels. more abdominal fat loss, and improved size of LDL particles. Despite this, many nutrition professionals still have the audacity to call low-carb diets harmful, then continue to peddle the failed low-fat diet that has been proven time and time again to be completely ineffective. Bottom line, despite fat having more calories per gram than carbs or proteins, studies have shown that high-fat and low-carb diets actually lead to more weight loss than low-fat diets. Number 8. Processed margarine is better than natural butter. Because of the war on saturated fat, butter became recognized as an unhealthy food. Food manufacturers jumped on the bandwagon and started producing butter replicates like margarine. Most margarines contain large amounts of processed vegetable oils, often with trans fats added to the mix. It is hard to imagine how people could think that processed, factory-made margarine would be healthier than butter, which is completely natural and humans have been eating for centuries. The studies also do not support the ideas that margarine is healthier than butter. In the Framingham Heart Study, margarine was associated with an increased heart disease risk compared to butter. Many other studies have looked at high-fat dairy products and found no evidence that they contribute to any disease. In fact, high-fat dairy is associated with a lower risk of obesity. Despite all the fear-mongering, high-fat dairy products like butter are extremely healthy, especially if they are derived from grass-fed cows. Bottom line, margarine is an unhealthy fake food produced in factories, usually containing trans fats and processed vegetable oils. Butter is a much healthier choice, especially if it comes from grass-fed cows. And let me stress, butter that comes from grass-fed cows that are not injected with hormones is healthy for you. Number 9, processed low-fat foods are healthy options. And I cannot stress this. This is the most important paragraph for you. Because of the ridiculous low-fat advice, food manufacturers remove the fat from some of their foods. But there was a major problem. Natural foods taste terrible without the fat. The food manufacturers realized this and added a whole bunch of sugar to compensate for the missing fat. For this reason, most low-fat foods are actually loaded with sugar, which is seriously harmful. If a food has low fat and diet on the label, then you will probably find sugar, corn syrup, and various artificial chemicals in the ingredient list. However, sales of these foods have skyrocketed because many nutrition professionals still advise people to eat them, even though the normal fat alternatives are much healthier. Now, the sources for all of these claims in this video can be found from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Thank you for watching the Shikama Live Show. Do not fall into the lie that meat is bad, eggs are bad, organic, grass-fed cows are bad. When they do their studies, what they study is the processed cow. Why? Because they're much more readily available. They have never, on the side of trying to get a governmental policy passed, they have never taken a farm-raised chicken, a grass-fed cow, and studied anything, any products thereof, none of the meat, none of the eggs, none of the dairy. No study that is going to tell you to eat a low-fat diet is ever going to include the heirloom organic versions of that product. So they're not going to study the cage-free chicken, the grass-fed cow, and study the meat from that, a clover-fed cow, the meat from that, or the eggs from the chicken, or the chicken meat, or the dairy products from the field clover-fed cow. They're just not going to study it. Why? Because there will be a drastic disparity between their findings with the chemically induced margarine and what have you, and the grass-fed cow, clover-fed cow. It's night and day in comparison when you look at it nutritionally. Thank you for watching the Shikama Live Show.